Okay, welcome everyone to the video lecture on Hinduism. This is for Module 3 of RST 161 World Religions. And the video lecture is entitled Hinduism, Many Paths to the Divine. And so right from the outset, we see this emphasis in Hinduism on affirming and celebrating many different paths, not one, but many different paths or spiritual orientations, different ways, different modes that a religious practitioner can approach the divine. So in this lecture, we're going to review and hopefully be able to reinforce some of the material that we've encountered in the chapter and in the videos. And I want to also introduce a few new concepts. And then lastly, I do want to share a few slides on Jainism, which is a distinct religious tradition that comes out of India, but many of its core tenets actually are shared in common with Hindu core tenets. And so I want to cover those, and then just also touch upon a couple of the things that makes Jainism unique, such as the extent to which ahimsa or nonviolence is practiced. And so we're not looking at Jainism in this class, this accelerated online class, but it is in the chat in the Fisher textbook, so you can always read up on it. And I just wanted to quickly give it sort of a brief introduction to it. So we'll be doing that at the end. So to get into these images that you see, these two images on the bottom left, we see a group of individuals that some of them are submerged in this Ganges River, the sacred Ganges River of India. A couple are walking along the river banks. So these are this is a famous site at Varanasi, the sacred city of Varanasi, and you can see a Hindu woman there with her hands clasped in prayer. That's actually called Anjali Mudra, just a fancy way of saying the form of prayer. And so she's making prayers in the morning and purifying in the river. And a lot of times the prayers in the morning will be made to Surya, the sun god Surya. And to know this immersion in the river is known as snana. One other thing to note about the Ganges River, it's in Hinduism, it's considered to be very sacred. And it's a goddess that's understood to be by many Hindu practitioners to be a goddess, a sacred goddess in and of itself. And a lot of ashes are put in this river, cremated ashes of deceased loved ones. Hindus will go on pilgrimage to this site or other sacred cities along the Ganges. And then by immersing the ashes in the river, the idea, it's kind of a folk belief in some ways, but there's a belief that that it's such a sacred river that the person that is the deceased person whose remains are put in the river almost gets like a shortcut to liberation, that moksha, liberation, that just by putting one's river, it's either a huge karmic boost for this individual, or this other long understood to be like a myriad lifetimes to approach the divine is all of a sudden kind of a shortcut through putting the ashes in the river. So that's just a common practice. And then a lot of you'll see images of crematorial ghats along the banks of this river. So charred remains that are kind of constantly being cremated. So the river, because of this, and also because of the fact that not everyone can afford to do a cremation. Sometimes bodies are just thrown into the river, corpses. And so the Ganges is a very, very, very polluted river. The idea is that most Westerners can't really swim in it because they'll get very sick. Then on this right-hand side, we see this kind of powerful image that is expressing a kind of a classic Hindu metaphor of a drop of water representing Atman, which is, as you saw in the textbook, it means something akin to like the self or the individual or the soul. And then Brahman, which is this larger body of water, or sometimes equated with the ocean. And the notion here is that the goal of the Hindu is seeing itself as this individual droplet is actually to merge with all of reality, this larger ocean, and this larger higher reality. When one loses the individual self, kind of sheds that notion of I, and they become this equated with this larger vision of higher reality, then that's when freedom comes. So um, Hinduism is many different, almost traditions in one, really. And so there's certain traditions like Advaita Vedanta, for instance, that really teaches this. The focus is on Atman and Brahman, and there's other traditions within Hinduism that don't focus on it quite so much. But this is just kind of a classic metaphor of the lower self that you try to merge with the higher self, Brahman. And one key term for that is called yoga, union. So the union of Atman or self or soul with Brahman is a key kind of fundamental goal for Hindus. Okay, so moving on to this second slide. Um, Here we see a historical evolution of Hindu religion, and this is just sort of an overview. And the kind of the purpose of this slide is just to kind of demonstrate that that a lot of what we know understand to be the core concepts of what is modern day Hinduism, so to speak, really has historical emergence and evolution has changed over time. And the original kind of tradition was this kind of almost distinct tradition altogether in some ways called the Vedic religion. And the Vedic is a word coming from Vedas. And so we know that this kind of ancient Vedic tradition was based on the Vedas, which is the sacred text in Hinduism. And the Veda is a Sanskrit word that means knowledge. And the idea is that you had these rishis and you see this image of one, that there's these seven, according to kind of the mythology, there's seven Hindu sages or seers that the sacred texts were like almost like in the universe itself or in the ether or something, and these seers were able to kind of see them and bring them and bring these sacred hymns out of the universe which were already there, and bring all this spiritual knowledge out of the universe which was already there. And then it was shared as an oral tradition. And then, as the text mentions, Vyas, the Hindu, later this also a sage in his own right, ends up kind of collecting them all together in one body of text. So that's known as the Vedas. And then the last part of the Vedas are the Upanishads, and these are later kind of texts or traditions that come out of the earlier Vedas, which are like the earliest Veda is understood to be the Rig Veda, and it's really more of like a hymn to these primordial deities. And so this early context, this kind of the larger point here is that this early context had much to do with like sacrificial rites. It had about bringing order to the world from chaos, so asat to rita, and so by doing these kind of rites, by making offerings to fires, which certain caste of people, the Brahmins, were responsible for doing, it would bring harmony to the world, and it would bring protection for the people individually and abundance, blessings of harvest, etc. But there's a sense of duty to actually like bring in the world. It's these deities that actually bring in the world and order to the world and blessings to the world, and you have to do these rites that in order to maintain the harmony and the renewing of the world. And so there's different deities. Some of these deities are still very active in modern Hindu religion. Indra has a mythological role, but people don't really worship Indra today. Is kind of this thundered warlike deity. Agni is the deity for fire. And that definitely is a sacred, considered to be very sacred by Hindus. Agni. Soma was this kind of this mystery liquid that was a visionary substance when ingested, and would also be offered to the fire. And then Surya, which I had mentioned, is the sun deity. There's a lot of different deities in this original Vedic context that were that each, they had different kind of stories equated with them, and but they were kind of understood to be have power, and they could be supplicated for various blessings. Um, so that's the early tradition, really focusing on from Asat, chaos, bringing order. And then later you see, so much of that is on ritual. It's really important to see that. It's like focusing on ritual and rites. And then later the Upanishads are kind of this new development, almost historical development, you could say, where where the tradition was recognizing that it wasn't just a focus on bringing order, but a sense of the light purpose of life is to awaken to spiritual knowledge, and then so you have the kind of the emergence of some of these concepts like karma. Karma is a word that means action. Here it's equated more with like personal action, and that the personal action that one does in the world has consequences. Law of cause and effect. And so you already see a little bit of a shifting of this concept of action, karma. Um, and then you have Brahman, again, a sense of higher reality or super consciousness, God, totality of all that is. Um, Sansara is how you say that word, and that's the wheel of the rebirth, cycle of birth and rebirth. Um, the notion of reincarnation there as well. So these are, the idea is that these are kind of emerging and as a separate body, a kind of separate emphasis. And then a lot of the Hindu teachings on spiritual knowledge are more focused on this particular part of the Vedas, the Upanishads. Um, then later we have another historical development, and so we see, as the slide here says, newer deities emerging. They have mythologies, and there's different stories that emerge. Some of these are recorded in the Puranas, and then you have the Indian epics, the Mahabharata. These great, really long, in the case of the Mahabharata, tales that were shared orally originally, and then the Ramayana, and that basically in they're of significance because they end up representing a lot of the kind of the values of Dharma, the duty in the world, social duty, and all these different notions of Dharma. And then in the case of a lot of it's also the kind of the social ideals or values. What does it mean to be an ideal husband or an ideal wife or an ideal child or an ideal warrior, etc., etc. All these different or an ideal ruler. All these kind of like social rules are played out, and it's really complex. They ends up representing these very complex themes that it's kind of messy to balance the individual duties, social roles with larger cosmic duties. And so I think that scholars will argue that these, rather than necessarily clarifying that it's really simple to figure out the notion of dharma or duty, that these texts actually they kind of make the statement that it's really complex, and one has to kind of like work it out on one's own. So they're really rich tales, and I know that the readings definitely covered both of these. So, but the idea here, the larger sense here, is that in these later devotional traditions, and you can see it's equated with 300 CE, and just as a note, the BCE and the CE is another way of just noting time. So the it's oftentimes we see BC before Christ, and AD, which is stands for Anno Domini, which is the year of the Lord. So anything past, that basically AD is another way of saying CE, and CE means Common Era, and then BCE means before Common Era. So scholars will just use that as kind of a more neutral way of marking time, but it's the same. It's equated with the same dates. So here we have in this 300 CE. Again, the emergence of these deities, and so here it's a kind of devotionalism. You see a lot of Hindus have devotional spiritualities where there'll be a certain deity it could be Rama, it could be Krishna, Kali, the goddess Kali, Durga. They might have a devotion to a certain deity, and so they have like maybe an icon in their place, or they go to a Hindu temple And then the idea is that by making offerings to the deity and having faith in the deity, then the deity brings blessings, material blessings and blessings of awakening, spiritual awakening, that is to say. So you just see that there's, the first context, there's a ritual action, and then later spiritual knowledge, and then this last context you have um, um, devotionalism and like to Shiva. If it's Shiva, there's known the Hindus are known as Shaivites. If it's to Krishna or Vishnu, it's the Hindus are known as Vaishnavites. And so you see these different forms of Hinduism emerge. Um, okay, so let's continue. So going into this third slide here, we have the four aims and stages of life. So the four aims of life, or purusharthas, are dharma, which is, I mentioned, religious and ethical duty. So that's one of the really important Hindu value or aim, that one is lives righteously, would be one way of saying it, and follows. There's the Hindu text called the Dharma Shastras, which lay out all these expectations for the best way to live in under certain social rules. Um, and that just the notion is that that you live, um, again, with a sense of righteousness, and we're taking right action, doing the right things, telling the truth, and so on and so forth, living nonviolently. So then we have artha, which is material prosperity, or you can say economic prosperity. Maybe you have children or family, and then you have to provide for them. And so, bringing material abundance. So that's an aim of life. Um, and then you have kama, which is, you could say, pleasure in the world. And sometimes that can even be equated with like sexual pleasure. And some of you may have heard of the Kama Sutra. Sutra is it means a text, basically. Um, so that just recognizes that it's a this worldly form of Hinduism. In Hinduism, we have this worldly and otherworldly forms of spirituality, where also known as world affirming and world denying forms of spirituality. So Hinduism recognizes both of those paths as being totally valid. And here's a case of the this worldly, where you're recognizing that pleasure is in line with Dharma, and in line with kind of one's spiritual growth. And there's kind of a sense among many Hindus that most individuals aren't in their lives necessarily ready to really pursue liberation, which is this kind of difficult thing to pursue. And a lot, so they're kind of just totally fine within this lifetime just pursuing dharma, and then in some lifetime down the chain, so to speak, they would then later pursue moksha when the circumstances are right. So so we see then moksha, liberation, is the final one. So yeah, that's the kind of otherworldly, this other, like going beyond the world in some ways, and then coming to this, spiritual knowledge, or merging with the divine, as I had stated previously. Um, so then we have the four stages of life, and these are grouped together intentionally, because you can some will actually, it's kind of common to equate some of these aims of life roughly with the stages of life. So like in the early, for instance, in the householder stage of the life, number 2, you see that dharma, artha, and kama, the three aims of life, are equated with that one. But moksha is actually saved for number 4 and number 3, the later stages of life. So just to note that that there's a kind of a notion that there's a progression in one's life where they can go from focusing on dharma and artha and kama, and then later in life, when you've done all these, kind of checked off those 3 boxes, then you can kind of start focusing on moksha, liberation. And then that's where you see at the end, like starting to the semi-retirement forest dweller stage, and then a renunciate, where in a renunciate stage, one cuts off all social ties, and they basically focus full time on, you might say, yoga or austerity, basically trying to become liberated from samsara. So I didn't mention the celibate student of the Vedas. That's called a brahmacharya. This first path, you can see in this image that these people, these the youth are gathering around this sage, and at this stage they would traditionally learn the Vedas, and um, and they would basically be trained on inculcated into different Hindu values, and then later that it would only be later that they would be become a householder and then go to these other stages. So you just get kind of see the different how there's a variety of different aims, and then one can become a renunciant early on. So you don't have to follow this path, and so you see that sometimes there's renunciants that are young, and they kind of skip over these other aims. Okay, so just to move on, we have this wasn't really laid out so much in the chapter. Tapas, this is a word that means austerity, and then sannyasa, renunciation. I just mentioned renunciation as one of the paths. So you see these two images, and um, it's just important when we get to Buddhism, we're going to be talking about the middle path and this notion of moderation. And Hinduism kind of recognizes that again, otherworldly forms of Hinduism recognize that there can be kind of a value to pushing one to the limit, pushing oneself to the limits, and putting the body to the limits, because the notion is that the body is kind of one is kind of slave to the whims of the body in various ways. That one is hungry, and then one becomes attached to food, and then you're dependent on food, or maybe it's a sexual desire, and so one becomes dependent on getting on trying to obtain sex in the world, and so that brings up all this web of dependencies, pain, the exposure to hot and cold weather, for instance. That all of these things, like you can kind of look at the individual, and the Upanishads go into this, and again those texts that I mentioned. And just that the person doesn't really have control over their life. They're kind of a whim. They're kind of a slave to the various bodily desires. And so tapas is a notion of like training the body, putting it to the test, and kind of using one's willpower to overcome those kind of dependencies, and then arrive at this greater sense of equanimity, and then equanimity itself is kind of a platform for going deeper into kind of spiritual awakening, or meditation, you might say too. So here we see, and this is a kind of a classic example of a Hindu austerity, and just to keep in mind that not all. There will be, like, a lot of Hindus will fast, and that's considered to be an austerity. But the number of people that do go to the extremes, the Hindus that go to practice more extreme forms of austerity, is relatively few. But here we do see this individual who is in the middle of these Pancha Agni, means five fires, and you see these fires around them, and sometimes it'll actually just be four fires, and the sun itself will be considered the fifth fire. So they're sitting in the hot of the day, and they're really pushing their body. They might be the idea is that you don't leave that space. So you're like, you're really pushing the limits, and that you're kind of like the will has resolved to kind of, I have a conviction to grow spiritually, and they might stay there for a day or 3 days or however long it is, and then that's a kind of the crucible to grow spiritually. The notion here very much is that the ego kind of keeps a person, what Hindus would call trapped in samsara. They're just kind of stuck in this egoic mode of consciousness, and so that there's so much complacency, and so one kind of has to force the issue, and that's what this notion of Hindu austerity or tapas seeks to do. Then we see on the right Hindu sannyasini. So she sees a female renunciate, and a lot of times when someone will renounce, you'll see that they don't cut their hair, so that she's got her hair. She's been doing this path for a really long time. Her hair is grown out, and and then you just you kind of see even just in her image, in her facial expression, a sense of kind of resolve, and a sense of I think there's a sense that it can be kind of a tough life too, to putting your body out there and through the extremes, and so it's kind of like a little bit of a warrior aspect to it, to kind of brave those extremes in order for the soul to achieve some sense of knowledge or deeper knowledge or awakening. So you see just this example of a sannyasini, or a renouncer. Okay, so to move on, going into this next slide, this is focusing on, again, this notion of multiplicity and many paths to the divine, and then the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually a text that's embedded within the Mahabharata, the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. Um, and so the Bhagavad Gita, that translates as Song of the Lord, and it's talking about Krishna, Lord Krishna, which is this deity, Hindu deity, an incarnation or an avatar of Vishnu, the deity Vishnu. So Krishna is this avatar of Vishnu, and Krishna comes to Arjuna, this character Arjuna, who's Arjuna has a place with throughout this larger epic of the Mahabharata, and Krishna gives him instructions on both duty as well as spiritual awakening. So dharma is the word for duty, and Krishna is actually telling Arjuna that you have to go fight these enemies that it's on this battlefield, and this other kind of kingdom is, even though Arjuna knows the people on the other side of the like some of them are family members and everything, he knows them, and he doesn't want to fight. How can I kill these people that I know and they're my own blood? And there's a larger sense of not wanting to engage in violence that Arjuna at all in the first place. And the notion here is that you must go follow your duty. You're also, Arjuna is a Kshatriya, which we'll get into caste later, but a warrior caste. And it's his duty in particular to go fight. And so Krishna's saying you have to go perform this duty. And the notion here is that this other kingdom had engaged in wicked deeds, and so they need to be, some of the wicked characters on the other side need to be taken care of. Battle. So these battles happen, and just to know that sometimes this is taken as spiritual metaphor. So, like Gandhi, for instance, read the Bhagavad Gita religiously, and he took it as like not actually. This isn't necessarily advocating violence. He took it as Arjuna was actually like representing any person's kind of soul, and that there's a battlefield that's like the ego is the demons are that one faces in life, and the ego is kind of the enemy, and one must stand up to one's own ego. So, but you can take it both ways, basically. But the notion is that you got to face. You can't run from it. You have to face the issue head on. That's kind of the notion of the Dharma here. And then the other notion is that he's actually giving them. He ends up kind of going into this other lecture altogether when he's in the middle of telling Arjuna that he has to go fight as a Kshatriya. He's saying, so there's all these other ways to achieve the divine. So he goes into I guess you could say it's kind of a tangent, but he starts talking about these 4 different yogas that the textbook brings up. Jnana is the yoga or the path of knowledge and philosophy. You can also say it's the intellect. You're using kind of reasoning as a way to, by philosophical reasoning, you can kind of get closer and closer to truth. And so someone like a historical figure like Socrates and Plato very much kind of advocated, you can see kind of advocating that path of the spiritual awakening dimension of pursuing philosophy and knowledge. So that's a path that's recommended. And then there's karma yoga. So maybe some people are more action oriented, and they're more socially or relationally oriented. And so their path to the divine might be better suited for what's called karma yoga, which is, again, ethical action, selfless service to others. Sometimes it's a notion of serving, maybe a guru in some cases. But this is a notion of karma yoga, doing good deeds, and then that kind of ennobles the soul and pushes a person sort of leads to further spiritual progression. And then another path is bhakti yoga, and this is equated to like love, and you could say love and devotion. A sense of bhakti yoga is going back to the devotionalism of these different deities that emerged later in Hinduism. You could be totally devoted and have faith in a certain deity. Um, and a lot, again, the notion here is that these deities, as the textbook mentions, it's kind of they're all different manifestations of the one higher reality, Brahman. So to see them as totally separate is misleading. Um, but there's this different kind of manifestations. You could see it. The analogy that I've heard used that's I think pretty effective is that, there's like a light, a beam of light, and then it shines through different colored panes of glass. And as it shines through different panes of glass, it takes on different colors and attributes. So that's what each of these different deities is kind of the different attributes through which the higher reality can shine through. But there is definitely a notion amongst many Hindus that these are actually the deities that exist, and that when you do call on them, they do perform, they give blessings and perform miracles and sort of thing like that. That there's a real sense that if you supplicate Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity, that your obstacles will be removed, and so there's a kind of a faith dimension. So this is just another path called bhakti yoga, this notion of devotion. Um, then we have last of all Raj Yoga, which is Raj actually means like Raj is like a king, and it also means like royal. So the notion here is of yoga. This is kind of like a supreme path of yoga, is what that word kind of signifies. Some scholars will actually say that because this path actually had 8 different limbs to it, it was only like a class such as like the royal class or aristocracy that would really have time to be able to practice all these different kind of exercises. So that's another kind of notion that comes with this. But this is so the yoga, we're talking about yoga, the different yoga. So one can take vows in this path. The 8 limbs are you take these different vows of like truth telling, and it can be practice nonviolence, non-stealing, um, um, only having so many possessions. There's all these different kind of purification practices that one does. That one lives an ethical, an upright life, and then they also there's other kind of limbs like pranayama, which is like the control of the energy of the body through breath. And then meditation, and asana is a word that if you go to a yoga studio, you'll hear. A word's posture. So you can settle into certain postures that facilitate a spiritual awakening from a Hindu perspective. And so eventually that culminates in the last limb called samadhi, which is actually a kind of understood to be this kind of super conscious state that's temporary, but it's like this kind of temporary merging with the divine. And so even that in itself is a step, because it kind of eventually, when one dwells in this state of, which is not understood to be a common thing that happens, but if someone achieves the state of samadhi eventually enough, then they'll become totally liberated, which is the moksha term. So you just, in this image again, you see that's Krishna in the blue instructing Arjuna on the left, and so that's coming in the Bhagavad Gita, and then addressing all these different ways that giving this kind of discourse, or you could say lecture of itself on all these different ways that one can approach the divine. Okay, so then this next slide we see. I want to bring this up. This is a teaching that's in the Upanishads about koshas, and it relates to yoga as well. But the idea here is that you have different layers of the body, and if you happen to know that the kind of the nested Russian dolls that you open up, and then there's another like doll within a doll, and it keeps going down and getting smaller and smaller. That's how some Hindus will see the body. So the body, the Annamaya kosha is like the food body or the physical body, but there's also different bodies within that body that you can't necessarily see, but one who is attuned to it could feel into these different layers or bodies. So the pranamaya kosha is another layer within the body that's called the subtle body or the energy body. Prana is a word that means like energy, and it's a subtle energy, and then it's very much equated with chi energy. I don't want to oversimplify that, but many will equate it with chi energy of for instance, Chinese thought and metaphysics, chi energy of like qigong, for instance, or tai chi. And then chi energy in Chinese thought is composed of these two different things, yin and yang energy. Um, so that'll be addressed later. But here we have the prana. So we have a subtle body, and then I'm going to mention something else about the subtle body in this next slide. But then we have going deeper with it, more interior within that prana maya kosha is the monomaya kosha, or the here it's translated as emotional body, but manas means a mind. So this is like the body of the mind, you could say, of the emotions of the mind. So that's a separate kind of mod. It's like all of these are kind of conjoined with each other on a spectrum. They're not totally independent, but there's here it's kind of a different layer of the body that you can see is, you address at a deeper level. And then you have this Vijnana Maya Kosha, which is this wisdom, or sometimes translated as intellect body. And so that's like another, just another kind of like a deeper wisdom. That the notion of monomaya is like all the different thoughts that the mind has, and this kosha is actually more like the intellect, which is always, gives out the perfect discrimination or perfect intellect. So that's this other body that's even deeper. And then lastly, Ananda Maya Kosha is this. Ananda means bliss. And then that's another kosha. So this word Maya, by the way, you see in each one of these koshas or layers of the self, the Maya means actually like an illusion, it's a word that means like magic, power, illusion. It's basically the notion is that each of these are a veil that actually, even the deepest layer is actually a veil that obscures this kind of purely divine. So one at the most interior level, one is Atman, which is equated with Brahman, but we don't. There's the physical body. There's all these different layers of experience that ends up obscuring this kind of pure perception. So Maya is all these like different veils through which this pure Atman becomes kind of obscured. So again, you can think about that from a couple slides ago. The person that's in the austerity, that five fires thing, that five fires austerity, and someone in meditation. The notion is to kind of go beyond, deeper, like let one's focus or attention go deeper within each of these different veils or koshas, so that one becomes kind of closer to pure perception. And then each of these layers, like the mind, one that again they're not subject to the vicissitudes or the fluctuations of the mind. They find some like sense of freedom beyond it. So that's again a focus of yoga. And by the way, a lot of the yoga in the U.S. and in Western cultures, kind of a more modern development of it is called a form of called hatha yoga. And it's just a focus. It has a physical kind of focus to it, really focusing on the asanas or postures, but definitely connected to this larger sense of it. That in of itself is a pathway. But some Hindus will look at it and they'll say that, well, it's more like physical focus, whereas like it may not have as much meditation involved in it. So that's just another to keeping in mind that a lot of times Hindus will see hatha yoga as like, oh, that purifies the body, and then it purifies the prana, the subtle body, but one also needs to go deeper than that in doing different practices like faith and deep meditation and stuff. So just keeping that in mind. And then, so to continue, one example of the subtle body, the prana maya kosha, is what's called kundalini. And you can see this is kind of like brought up in California New Age circles, I guess you could say. But the notion is that along the spine, there's these different energy centers or centers of consciousness, you can say, that awaken when somebody is in, let's say, deep meditation or in some sort of ecstatic state or in a state of deep faith or something, and that it kind of moves up the spine, and it can be, it can be understood sometimes that it can happen spontaneously. Um, and then there's also notions that sometimes they're more or less active at different times. A lot the kind of an important notion with the Kundalini and these seven chakras is that a lot of times it'll be explained that most individuals are in either these first three, the root, sacral, and solar plexus chakras, um, or the first four, the moving into like the heart. It's just called the Anahata chakra. Um, so these are different chakras that the notion here is that someone might be like, if some people if these chakras are dominant, which most people they're kind of stuck in these kind of dynamics, and they might be addicted to. They might be really fearful and focused on survival, or they might have be um, focused on sexual desire, or they might be focused on kind of power games. Um, there can even be a notion of like maybe love, where someone might be attached to love. So there's maybe a higher reality that even goes beyond relational love. Um, but the notion is that through one's faith in yoga, that you eventually go up into these higher level chakras, and when that happens, then it kind of catalyzes this larger awakening process. And then there's what's called, important to know that there's a lot of gurus or saints are equated in India with having these kind of spiritual powers or gifts called they're called siddhis, and these siddhis can include like, in the case of the third eye, if the third eye chakra is known, it's called Ajna chakra. If that opens or starts, like a wheel starts spinning, it's sometimes understood to be a wheel. Then someone can have like psychic visions. They might have, they're understood to maybe have some sort of prescient powers and understanding the future, or the kind of a visionary access. Um, and then this last one is the crown chakra, which if someone reaches that state, then it's this state of great bliss, and that's kind of the one reaches samadhi at this last step, or this last super conscious state, when all the energy goes into this crown. Not all Hindus affirm this kind of path. A lot of times and again, in the kind of a new age California thing, or just new age thought in general, you have different colors that are associated with different chakras, and different gemstones that are associated with different chakras. And in late Hindu scriptures, and late tantric Hindu scriptures, you do see some of these connections that are made, but these are more modern kind of developments that people, not to say that it either is not valid or not valid, but these are just a little bit more modern associations that are made. So again, that the yeah, so just to note that these are different chakras that the textbook mentions, and I wanted to give you an image of what it looks like here. Okay, so then to move on, we're getting down to we're moving along pretty well. Getting into the historical origins of Hinduism. I wanted to touch on this because this is a kind of a confusing and controversial topic, and we'll see if I can kind of like kind of give the gist of it and why it's controversial. So so we have, okay, what is, who are the people that kind of populated India, and where does the Hinduism come from? Where does the Vedic religion come from? Where do all these teachings come from? Basically, early scholars had come up with what was called the Aryan invasion hypothesis or theory, and the notion was that so you see in this left image that around the Caucasus region of the Caucasus, like mountains, that these people, this Indo-European people that were later called Aryans, ended up spreading all throughout Europe and into the East and into Central Asia, um, down into Iran and then down into India. And so the idea here was that all of the Vedic religion, um, all of the Vedic religion comes from these people that came in and invaded India. So they were like a lighter skinned peoples that came into India, and then in India already at this time were Dravidian peoples, which are darker skinned individuals. Um, and so the peopling of India is this this mixture between two peoples, and the notion is that these scholars, early scholars, had all these assumptions coming from Europe and projected all these kind of like some of it was colonial and racist assumptions that the religion was entirely brought basically from was entirely brought from these migrating peoples and then imposed upon the Dravidian peoples. And so um, and that notion was that they brought chariots and everything, and then they military conquering, um, and then so much of it is based on linguistic evidence. And so the notion is that to me, there's different ways that it's explained. To me, it's not the linguistic, it's not the migration that is like really the controversial aspect. It's the question is really how much of Hinduism can be attributed to these people that migrated versus kind of this combination of the people that were there mixing in with the people that migrated down. Um, so the mixing and then the kind of the mutual influencing is called the cultural transformation thesis. And just the notion is that the first scholars, they did not have this narrative. They made all these assumptions that it was like Hinduism is totally a product of these people that brought that brought the religion. And so like where does the notion of karma come from? Where does the notion of like the meditation practices and yoga, samsara, where what are the origins? And so again, the cultural transformation is saying they emerged from the kind of the cultural contact zone of both of these cultures, mutually influencing one another. And then the other invasion theory, or here I'm saying it is Indian migration, um, is that it was imposed upon. All of it all of it comes from the Vedic early Vedic tradition. It all comes from the Indo-European people. So um, as the textbook mentions, there's also this Harappan civilization in the or Indus Valley civilization that's in the in the northwest part of India, and so we don't know the language. We have all these. We can see the archaeological findings from there, and we have all these tablets, but we haven't deciphered the language yet, so we don't know if these were the people that were. The question is, are these European peoples that had this civilization? Are they the Dravidian indigenous peoples that were again indigenous to India? Who were these people? Are there parallels between the Vedas and the Vedic religion and the civilization, which was very ancient? We're talking about 3000 BCE, so really ancient civilization, and a very advanced, also a very advanced civilization. Having like even at this time, they had administrative kind of center and structure to the cities that were in that they discovered, and irrigation and just all various technological advancements that was pretty impressive at this time. So that's kind of like another question that is a controversial aspect of all of this. But really, the main thing is that so there are some that will totally bring into question whether there was a migration at all in the first place. I will say that I don't um, I don't see that at all because of the in terms of the dispersion of Indo-European peoples. Linguistic evidence to my mind is totally overwhelming that you see these the Indo-European languages that are reflected in Sanskrit, reflected in like Persian language, the Iranian, and then reflected in Europe. So, and in the Germanic languages, and then in English and in Latin and Greek, you can see that even so, like for instance, in the Sanskrit term for horse is Ashvin, and then in excuse me, it's Ashvi, and then in I think it's Lithuania, the same as an older form of Lithuanian language. There's a word for horse again is Ashvi. It's like pretty much the same word. So you have a lot of like these same words that are in one culture found in other culture, and then a lot of the linguistic structures is the same. So basically, the notion is that they didn't find any chariots, and they began questioning the whole hypothesis in the first place. But I think most will kind of say, most scholars will say, okay, well, this is actually a question of like how much of these Hindu teachings come from either exclusively the Indo-European peoples or a combination of the mixture. Because also in the Dravidian peoples I mentioned were already like they had were worshiping various deities, and many will argue that they had these kind of yogic practices, and so can be a fusion. Um, so just that's I don't know if I was able to simplify that very well, but just in this next slide you can see some of the Indo-European. These is not actually a very exhaustive list, but you can see that like for instance in the English word father, and then in Spanish padre or Greek pater, Latin pater, and then Petri is the word, or Pitar. You can see how it's transliterated here is in the Sanskrit. The same with mater, and then mitri, or that's actually matri in Sanskrit. You can see the kind of ekam and uno, so the kind of agnis in the Latin ignis. Um, the Theos and Devas. In Iran, they discuss, there's a word Devas in the ancient Zoroastrian tradition of Iran, where the Devas in Hinduism means these deities that are like Devas is the word for God, like the gods, like that Shiva and Kali are Devas, and in Iran they meant the word Devas appears, but it means like demons. So it's like basically these entities that were the meaning. The word ends up meaning something different, but it's this notion of kind of these unseen beings or gods. Um, so there's another word I mentioned earlier in the lecture called Rita. That has a linguistic structure with the word that word Rita means order, and that is a linguist. You can see the linguistic parallel with order. RD, RDER, and Rita, order. There's a lot of words like that you can look at in a long. If you get assemble a larger list, where they correspond. So just to know that a lot of that theory originated from these linguistic parallels, but again they discovered all of that at a time when they were making all these assumptions about. And a lot of it was based on kind of the superiority of these Indo-European peoples, which is obviously just these assumptions that were made by people who were European. Um, so just to kind of lay out all that. And then now moving in, I want to show you some of the Hindu deities. Um, so the word iconography means like the expression, the visual expression of the different icons of the different images for each of these deities. And so a lot of there will be different stories and mythologies that all of the different imagery that you see on them. A lot of times there'll be stories associated with what you see. So we see Shiva here. Shiva is a deity of, I could say a lot about him, but he's a deity of yoga and destruction. He represents the principle of destruction. And in Hinduism, destruction is actually seen as a positive thing, because things need to be kind of, for negative things in the world need to be kind of destroyed in order to create new life. And that's how change, even change itself is a principle that needs the kind of unraveling or the natural entropy of things falling apart and then being rebuilt. So he's equated with the mountains. the Himalayas, and then he has a consort named Parvati, another goddess. And then Kali is this fierce. You can see the extreme imagery. The severed head. The severed head is often um, understood to be a demon, so it can be the destroyer of demons. You can see the all the heads collected on the necklace of heads, the demon heads, and then all the arms. This garland or this skirt of the arms, and then that's actually Shiva that she's standing on. So it's kind of representing the supremacy of her over even this great god of Shiva. And so for the people who who worship Kali, Kali is totally supreme, and her energy is Shakti. So the Shakti is this divine sacred energy in this. It's like prana. It's the more tantric. Again, Hinduism is all these different traditions. So she's a tantric deity that this Shakti is this kind of this equated with this the feminine energy that's like this live, very uh, um, vibrant energy that even all of the world is reliant upon this Shakti energy, and even Shiva gets his power from this Shakti energy that Kali is like a absolute embodiment of. You can see this sword is kind of like can be equated with the ego, so like you have to have this kind of fierce bravery and a sense of like cleaving it and attacking it head on again. So Kali she'll be portrayed as blue and dark, this dark goddess, and the word Kali actually means black. And so you just see this really fierce imagery and the notion there is again a kind of a bravery and a fearlessness, a total fearlessness. Um, so, okay, going into this next slide, we have the deities Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, and these are important just because they represent what's called the Trimurti, three forms. Murti means form, and they represent. Brahma is the creator deity. Shiva, who I mentioned in this previous, you see him on this bowl called Nandi. He is the god of destruction. Vishnu is the god of preservation, so it brings order and preservation. So a lot of different Hindu deities can be expressions or avatars of these kind of fundamental deities, Shiva, Vishnu, and these are also seen as like properties of the universe. It's kind of hard to explain that or understand that in some way, but it's like this is the kind of seen as a cycle. Like you could easily make these three deities kind of put arrows from one to the next and say this is like the cycle in which the universe is always perpetually renewing itself. Brahma is always creating a new expression of life in each new moment, waking moment. Shiva is always kind of the dissolution or at some point everything kind of comes to an end. Even the Roman Empire, right? Like comes to the end or whatever. And then our lives come to an end. Vishnu is the sense of preservation and stability and kind of nurturing in some ways as well. So here just know that Brahma is not usually worshipped in modern times, but Shiva is, Vishnu is, and Shiva can sometimes can sometimes manifest in the form of a stone called a Shiva lingam. There's not usually other deities that are associated with Shiva in terms of like Shiva showing up as an avatar other than Shiva himself. But Vishnu shows up in many different forms, including Krishna, including Rama from the Ramayana, and actually, the Hindus will even say that the Buddha is an incarnation of the historical Buddha from Buddhism, is an incarnation of Vishnu, but that's also kind of this like kind of sectarian way of getting at like trying to absorb Buddhism into their own fold, and rather than it like allowing Buddhism to be this kind of challenge to Hinduism and going off in its own path. So that take that for what it is, what you will. But just again to know that this is kind of this cycle, these three different Brahma creation, Shiva destruction, Vishnu preservation, and then the cycle just goes around and around. Okay, to continue, we have the goddess Durga. In the mythology of Durga, we have her confronting all these deities, or excuse me, these as great demons, and she's like the only. All these other gods tried to destroy these demons that were wreaking havoc in the world, and then finally Durga is called, and then she's this fierce, a great warrior goddess that is finally able to destroy the demon. So the goddess Durga is worshipped by many in the goddess traditions. Um, and then Krishna is, again, I mentioned, that's who shows up in the Bhagavad Gita, and it's an expression of Vishnu. Um, a lot of, like you may have heard of Hare Krishnas, they worship Krishna. And the notion here is to like, that, um, there's a celebration of kind of the love. It's the notion of kind of like this divine love, and that you can be intoxicated with this divine love and appreciation for the world. So you see Krishna playing this flute, and there's a whole story associated with that I won't get into here. But the notion is that you celebrate, you can sing songs and increase your faith. Um, but all of these deities, some of them it is sectarian, where someone will have a particular deity and they kind of like exclusively worship that deity. But a lot of modern Hinduism is kind of a sense that a lot of Hindus will recognize that it could be any of these deities, and a Hindu temple might have multiple deities installed in it that one makes offerings to. So there is a sense of pluralism built into the tradition, um, where um, you know there are goddess traditions, and there's Vaishnavites and Shaivites, and sometimes there's even kind of like rivalries between these groups of people. But a lot of times there's also a sense of like you can be worshiping all these deities at once. Um, then you move on to this next slide, Hindu deity. The iconography of these final two ones. You have the Hanuman from Monkey God Hanuman. So we saw the exploits of Hanuman in the story of the Ramayana. He's the image of like a bhakti in many ways, and karma yoga service, because he was totally devoted to the case of Rama and freeing Sita in the story, and his great faith allowed him to leap from India to Sri Lanka in order to. That's where Ravana is staying, in this island of this demon Ravana is staying, and who had abducted, stolen, Sita. So Hanuman is this kind of, you can see he's opening his heart. He's got Rama and Sita in his heart. So it's like this notion of total devotion and total surrender. And then so here, Ganesh, just so you know, is equated, a pretty common Hindu deity, is equated with, as known as being a bringer of blessings and remover of obstacles. So a lot of times businesses will have to remove the obstacles to prosperity in their business. They might have Ganesh. They might also have Lakshmi, who is this goddess of wealth and prosperity. Just to know that he's also the deity of new beginnings, and so at the beginning of some enterprise, Hindus may go see Ganesha in a temple and make offerings. Um, so yeah, so you get the sense here that some of the diverse images that you can see in Hinduism for the iconography. Okay, so to move on, I actually want to give a couple examples of revered figures of sometimes either called gurus, or sometimes they're called self-realized masters. And so the idea is that what is the goal? Again, the ultimate goal for Hinduism is to become spiritually awakened and eventually reach this freedom from samsara. And so, these are, in India, recognizes that there's a lot of individuals. It's not common, but there are a lot of individuals that end up achieving this kind of state, and they become kind of saints, and they become revered, and people go to them and try to get blessings from them and spiritual wisdom from them. One of them is Sri Ramakrishna, a saint of India from the 19th century. If you've ever heard of Swami Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda was a disciple, the lead disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, and Vivekananda is he actually ended up coming to the Parliament of World Religions in 1893 in Chicago, and then ended up giving this kind of riveting speech about Hinduism and all this. It was actually in English, and so that brought a lot of notoriety to um, the sort of this some of the just the merit of the some of the Hindu paths, and he kind of brought like a lot of like he's known as the kind of everyone was totally captivated by his lectures at that parliament. So anyway, the Ramakrishna is known as this. He actually was a devotee to the goddess Kali. He would his life story. He would go spontaneously go into samadhi, this ecstatic super state of consciousness. Um, and he ended up having all these devotees, or all these disciples, all these people would come to him and recognized him as being this like, self-realized master. He was in Calcutta, and he would just, throughout the night, he would see people, and then eventually he got throat cancer because he was always talking to disciples, and this notion that you just totally forget about your own health. You just become a servant to humanity. So he's really widely revered in India. Mata Mritanandamayi, on the right here, she's currently still living, and she's also known as Amma, the hugging saint. So she actually travels around the world. Um, I think the number of total people that she's hugged, or it's called giving darshan to. That darshan is a term that shows up in the readings. It's a sacred site of. So you when you see get the blessings of this deity, or the blessings of a guru, that it's like they're looking at you and they're seeing. You're getting this sacred vision of them, and then it's like supposed to be a great blessing. And so she's hugged. People will show up by the thousands, tens of thousands, to hug her. And over the course of her lifetime, it's said that she's hugged over 30 million people across the world. And that's probably not an exaggerated figure. I mean, she's been doing these, traveling around the world, doing, hugging thousands of people for many, many years. And I wanted to include her because you can you can actually, as someone, this is someone who can actually go and meet her and hug her. And she comes to LA like usually once a year. So just so you know, that as like something to keep in mind. But I just wanted to give you an example of someone who's still living, that a lot of Indians and Hindus will recognize as being a saint. So then let's see. So again, these two individuals are known as having siddhis, these spiritual powers, and a lot of various individuals like Sai Baba and all these different individuals in the course of India are known to kind of have achieved this state. Um, okay, moving on to this final. And again, a word for like a self-realized master who teaches others is called a guru. So I think everyone knows that term, guru. So then we get into this final slide here. This is on puja and a ritual of offerings to a deity. And so in this slide, we see that you see this Brahmin priest, and they're all gathered around, and they're bringing offerings of fruit. Sometimes incense will be made, and light will be shined in front of the iconography. Here, I think you can see the image up there. I think that's Durga, actually. So they're making offerings to this deity, Durga. And this is called a puja. So this is a rite of regular. It can be daily puja or just during certain festivals, but it means like the making offerings to a one deity or another. Okay, so lastly, I want to just show three slides on Jainism, and I want to cover this just really quickly, as quickly as I can. So These are all these five great principles of conduct for Jainism are called the Maharatas, and you can see um, ahimsa means on that they're here they're equated with different limbs of the tree. Ahimsa means nonviolence. Satya means truthfulness. Asteya means non-stealing. Brahmacharya means celibacy or chastity. It's a sense of preserving one's vital energy, and and then a parigraha means non-possessiveness, so only having a few possessions and not being attached to one's possessions. The two that are most important for Jains are ahimsa, non-violence. That is the most important. There's a saying, ahimsa paramo dharma for Jainism. Ahimsa is the greatest religion or the greatest law or duty. And then a parigraha, you can see that many Jains will only have a very few belongings, and the notion is that you don't not you don't want to be attached to one's material possessions. Um, so you see this image of this person. There's a whisk broom down there, and then there's a mask. This is not all Jain ascetics. This is a Jain ascetic. So there's Jain householders that have a less ascetic based path, getting back to the notion of this worldly versus otherworldly. But he's got this mask on because he's trying to protect this figure, this monk here. This Jain monk is trying to protect little microscopic beings that are in the air. So the mask is so that when he's speaking or if he's eating, the expulsion of air is not like it's not causing violence to the little microscopic beings. They're called nagodas that are like in the air, and so it's just like this going to this really utmost extreme to protect all living beings, even microscopic beings that Jains will say are in the air all over the place. And then the whisk broom is for the sweeping away of little insects. So like if someone is going to sit down, they'll make sure they'll sweep this little spot to make sure that there's no like little tiny insects. That because if they kill it, then it's considered to be really bad karma. So in the Jain ascetic path, you have to do everything you possibly can to not kill any creatures. And there's a notion that every creature is endowed with this what's called jiv or soul. And so even this tiniest creatures, every creature wants to live and have the opportunity to kind of naturally grow spiritually through being alive. And you can't, and therefore you have to really do one's best not to violate that kind of sacred. You don't want to end needlessly end any creature's life before their time, basically. So that's just showing that so that you can see the kind of the extremes to which this practice is. It sounds really probably crazy and extreme maybe in some ways, but if you just think about kind of the logic of it, like, well, how do we know that, like the assumptions that are built into some of the that are kind of anthropocentric, for I think for understandable reasons, or maybe for some reasons that could at least be challenged, where you have a notion of like just thinking about, well, if do other creatures have a natural right to live? Are they maybe do they want to go, and a lot of animals have children or offspring, I should say, and they enjoy life, and so they should have this that there's a notion that who are we to like go out and if we're not paying attention to where we're walking and just to step on, and then it really does matter for that insect. So Jains would be really careful about like how they walk around and where they're walking and everything, and then what foods they eat. Jain, they'll have their own kind of vegetarian diet, a special diet. Then see ahimsa here. So ahimsa is, again, as I mentioned, ahimsa parama dharma, and nonviolence is the greatest religion. You see this other sadhvi, this female mendicant or female nun. She's got that broom, and then she's holding this posture of signifying nonviolence. and then the mango tree on the right. It's this classic Jain metaphor about how there's the different kind of levels of aggression versus nonviolent mindsets that people have. So each of the notion here is that the tree is alive, and you don't want to cause harm to the tree. Um, and so you have the most aggressive person trying to just to get a mango, coming up to a tree and like going to cut off the entire tree with a chainsaw, kind of, or chop it down, and then just to get a mango. Then there's another person that's going to remove entire branch, like cut off entire branch. Then another person will remove entire limb of a just to get a mango. Um, and then another person will pick the tree, pick the mango, and then another person is actually just whatever mangoes have already naturally fallen from the ground. They're just picking them up and solely eating those mangoes. So the notion is that there's various um, the various attitudes that are the most nonviolent, that one should go for this ideal of kind of just being the one that seeks creating total minimal violence in the world, and just even go just pick not even picking a mango from a tree. Um, and then lastly, we have the notion of anekantavada. This refers to that the reality is always multifaceted, and the truth of reality always emerges from considering reality not from one perspective, but from from all these different angles. And so this also apply. This is still, all of these values are that I've mentioned, like ahimsa is very important in Hinduism as well, and all of the um, again, the five Jain principles are the same as the yama of the Hindu yoga. So ahimsa, satya, steya, brahmacharya, parigraha. Those are all the embedded within Hindu yoga too. In the first limb, yama, self-control. Um, but anekantavada, it's not a term that is really used in Hinduism, but this is a classic Indian metaphor of this elephant. Um, and and so Hindus will refer to it too as especially in Advaita, this tradition called Vedanta. So we have a notion of, sometimes explained as three blind men and an elephant, and so you have this notion of coming across an elephant, and then one person's they're blindfolded, they're touching it and being asked what is it, and one says they're touching the side of the elephant, and they're saying, this is, feeling it, it's very solid, it's kind of totally perpendicular, and this is clearly a wall. Someone's feeling the tail of the elephant, and they're feeling the texture of it, and there's it just feels exactly like a rope. So the person says, "Oh, the reality of what I'm touching, it's a rope." And then someone's touching the tusks, and they're feeling it, and it's sharp on the end, it's hard, made of the ivory. And it says, "Oh, it's a spear." And so basically they're touching all these different parts of the elephant, and then each one comes to a totally different conclusion. And the notion is that they're all right, but they're all correct in a limited way. And the ultimate truth is that what they're actually touching is an elephant. And so if they were to combine all of their perspectives together, that would end up leading to the greatest truth. Um, so anyway, it's kind of you can kind of see it. I think there's actually a children's book that kind of gets at this notion too. But the idea is that, there's a sense of being humble about the perspective that one has, because there's always other perspectives that can be added that cumulatively add up to a higher picture of reality. And so Jains actually think that thinking that having the conviction that one is right is a kind of an aggression. It's a kind of the opposite of ahimsa at the level of one's perception, because they think that they're right, and it's kind of this hubris or egotism that one thinks that they're right. So there's a practice called syadvada, where one actually qualifies their speech, and that's a way of being like nonviolent in one's speech, is saying, this is just, I don't know this with any certainty. But the practice actually, you can say syad at the beginning of a sentence, but it represents this larger notion of like saying, in my opinion, or just based on what I've seen personally,
or some will say it's a way of like just kind of recognizing that one's own perspective is limited and there's other perspectives to take into account. So this is a kind of a some will say is a distinct and really important value in Jainism. Um, so I just wanted to give you some initial exposure to those, since we're not going into the chapter, but I thought these kind of might be of initial interest for this world religions class. So that concludes the lecture for this week. I hope this was a value tuning into this, and you all learned and were able to kind of deepen in your understanding of Hinduism. Um, and yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. And I hope you all enjoyed the rest of the readings and the videos for this week. And good luck on the quiz. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you later. Bye bye.